Hello and welcome, my name is Trismegistus, and today we're going to be reading through and speculating about the latest Factorio Friday Facts. Friday Facts 409, Diminishing Beacons. Posted by V and Erendel. Hello, today we're going to take a look at a feature some of us have dreamt of changing for years now, the beacon transmission. The main purpose of beacons is to allow massively increasing your production in the late game while being more than just a module or a faster machine. To make use of beacons, you need to adjust your building layout for them. Beacons succeed in this role, but the problem. We aren't so sure the resulting layouts are all that interesting, something both of us and a lot of players have said many times before. The first screen capture shows a 12 beacon build, as it says in the caption. The first of the typical two layouts is surrounding the machine with the maximum 12 beacons, which is to say 12 beacons affect each assembling machine. Just to make that crystal clear, we've obviously got the assembling machine in the middle here, and the 12 beacons are in these 4 arrays of 3 each. This is the maximum number of beacons you can get around a machine, and it does allow you the one tile of gap between the arrays. You can obviously slightly rearrange these depending on where you want to route belts, but essentially this pattern, or one like it, is one that you'll end up repeating if you want to do 12 beacon builds. They then indicate 3 of the key points about this build, the first being that it has the best compute performance, the second is that it's not so space efficient, and the third is that it's costly on both construction materials and power draw. So by best compute performance, they do literally mean the compute of your PC. When you have 12 beacons, the maximum number of beacons, because the scaling in the base game is linear, that gives you the maximum boost. Therefore, you effectively get the maximum amount of productivity bonus per second, or in the case of the game, per game tick. In other words, by speeding the machine up to its maximum, you get more free items per second. And that's obviously a bit of a performance benefit. The last point there, costly on both construction materials and power draw. I would absolutely echo that. Construction materials is meaning both the amount for the beacons themselves, which are actually fairly expensive. You've got quite a lot of steel in the build, but in particular it also means the number of modules that you need. As you can see, you can overlap the beacons, so it's not quite as bad as it initially seems, but even then you still have to produce a very large number of speed modules in order to make this sort of build. So usually when you do something at a 12 beacon scale, you need to be building entire dedicated factories to making modules. Otherwise, you simply won't get there. The other part to that as well is the power draw. Every time a beacon affects a machine, it increases its power demand, so that scales up. But in particular, the number of beacons that you are building, each of which has a very large power draw, means that you need a phenomenal amount of power. When I live streamed my Megabase series, and I've said this in quite a few videos, but I ended up with around 1 million solar panels, and even then it didn't actually supply all the power to all of my base. But if you're going absolutely everything at 12 beacons, you have to be planning, as well as your module build, for a massive solar build. The middle one there, not so space efficient, is kind of a double-edged sword, which is what they go on to say in the next point. It's easy to route a lot of belts through as there's space all around the crafting machine. In fact, it is so easy that it feels like the endgame layout isn't very challenging to build. The next screen capture, the caption is a 12 beacon build map view, and basically your entire base does end up looking like this. This cross shape here is the beacons. You've got the assembly machine in the middle, and the yellow and what have you around that are the belts and the inserters in order to put things in. I would say that there is a little bit of a challenge still. I think it's a little disingenuous to say that there's no challenge. The challenge usually is around getting the volume of resources in. Because these 12 beacon machines are so fast, they eat a lot of raw material. But you do want to have lots of overlap because that reduces the number of beacons that you have to build. But of course, if you get to the middle of that build, there's a very good chance that the resources you've been pushing in have all been used up by the external machines. So you end up with a kind of a maximum size, unless you start to do clever things with like refreshing belts and things like that. And I would say there is significant challenge in that, but it's a challenge that you kind of solve once in a sense. You know, once you've worked out in this array they've got here how to get the material the blue science needs in, then you've done it. Say for example your solution involves vertical lines that refresh or push stuff in, then you're just copying and pasting that across, dozens of times, basically. So it is a challenge, but it's a challenge that once solved, you've solved it, basically. It just then notes that there are a few small variations you can make, like bringing the side beacons closer, but overall, most of the 12 beacon layouts look identical for the vast majority of recipes. So late game factories end up looking like arrays of squares. And that is very true. And it is, to be totally frank, a little bit boring. The next screen capture shows the other really popular alternative, which is the 8 beacon build. The other option is alternating rows of machines and beacons. In this case, 8 beacons affect each assembly machine. And here we have the alternating rows. So you've got your beacons along the top and the bottom here, and you've got your machines in the middle. Now what you can do is then repeat that. It doesn't really show it. And you do in this one have some difficulty usually around powering the machines because the substations have only a limited range. And of course, if you want to repeat this pattern, you wanted assembly machines on a second row here or above, you need to be thinking more in terms of the medium power pole rather than the substation, because this is right in the way of where you want to do stuff. However you do it, essentially, you need to be thinking more in terms of how do I squeeze the power in, because beacons only have a 3-tile range, so you only have 2 tiles available to work with. And the whole point of this build is that all of the machines are next to each other, so that you get the same effect for every machine. So go on to identify the 3 main points of the build. First is the greater space efficiency, then we've got a good cost to gain ratio, and not much space for belts. So obviously the first and the third there are kind of linked together. You've got a lot more space efficiency, but that space efficiency means you've got nowhere really to squeeze in belts. The cost to gain ratio is basically talking about how the amount of resource you're having to put in other words, the number of modules you're having to build, the number of beacons you're having to build, is much better, in a sense, for an 8 beacon build. So I would echo that. I came to a conclusion for my megabase attempt that where I'd rigidly stuck to 12 beacons, that was a bad idea. Instead, I should have done maybe a mix of 8 and 12 beacons. I think the benefit you get out of something, for example, steel being 12 beaconed, is significant enough to justify it. Something like maybe red science or maybe even smelting itself. 8 beacons is probably a better way to go because of the reduction in resource required and particularly the reduction in power demand. I think balancing the 2 up is probably a better way to go with the current base game, although it sounds like this is going to be quite a radical change that they're talking about. With just the 2 tile gap between the beacons and the machines, you can only route very few transport belts through. There are a few tricks that help when getting up to 2 transport belts in and 1 transport belt out, but once you've discovered these tricks, you just repeat them over and over. Alternatively, since this is quite space efficient, it's good for robot logistics, in which case you just copy and paste requester plus provider chest pairs next to machines, which isn't exactly creative either. And I think that is very true. Bot-based builds work better, if I'm totally honest, for both 8 and 12. Maybe not 12 so much, but certainly for 8 beacon builds, bots are just like the super solution, because you can kind of surround them with roboports, and this whole thing of having to weave belts in and do all of this sort of malarkey is just completely defeated by bots. You do need a lot of bots, and you do need to be very careful about how you arrange them because of the sort of logic of how it does bots, which they are of course improving. But even so, a bot-based 8 beacon build is kind of probably a really good compromise between everything. Maybe it's not quite as UPS efficient as belts, but I think 8 beacon bot-based is probably how I would try and do a lot of stuff if I was to do that series again. Since there aren't many other significant alternatives to these 2 layouts, all in all, using beacons seems restrictive on build variety and tends to feel monotonous and uninteresting, especially compared to how varied the early stages of the game are. You do end up with this situation that basically every megabase kind of looks the same, and that's fine. It's, we have to remember, I think in particular with this type of issue, that you're talking about a subset of the community who builds megabases and actually wants to do that. Most people, when they get a megabase, it's of the smaller scale, and you can do that with an 8 beacon build, so it's not that resource hungry. There is the challenge of working out how to get belts in and all this sort of stuff. So I think they're being a little down on it. But I would say that it does end up being identical no matter what. For a personal point of view, I kind of lose interest in that end of the game, and it's why I only did a Mega Base series after thousands of hours of playing, because the bit that I enjoy is the designing and the creating side of it. And of course, once you've got a 12 beacon build and you're literally just changing the recipe and exactly what's being fed in on belts, it's not actually all that interesting. And when I actually did the Mega Base build, I built the bases that I did, the factories essentially. They weren't like this. You didn't have all of the science all together. Instead, I did a purple science build, a gold science build, a blue science build, and brought them all together via train. It's one of the reasons it was horrible on UPS, but it meant that I could design a blue science factory. I could design a purple science factory to make the exact number of science packs that I wanted. But as I say, that was just because that's what I enjoyed doing in the game. It's not actually the best way of trying to do this sort of thing. The ideas. Over the many years this problem has been discussed, we've thought of various ideas. There's also been different experiments with what the modding API allowed, which is also a telltale sign that a lot of people would like some form of a change. Beacon overload. Beacon overload is a mechanic from Erendor's mod Space Exploration. It causes any machine affected by more than a single beacon to shut down. This means that the 12 beacon, 8 beacon, or any other beacon layout are just strictly impossible. With the normal beacon range, you could still do the inverse of the 12 beacon design and surround a single beacon with machines. But it gets impractical to repeat and tile because there are now 12 machines needing inputs and outputs instead of one. When trying beacon overload, it feels fresh at first. The beacons are more powerful at a base level and have more module slots, so an individual beacon is more flexible. There is a much larger benefit in dropping down the occasional lone beacon to boost random areas of production, but you need to be careful not to overlap a machine with 2 beacons and overload it. The problem is that there's not much flexibility in the beacon arrangements. Typically, you're just building beacons in a grid which avoids overlaps, so it's not much more interesting than the base game. It does look better though, at least. And here we go, so we've just got a screenshot from the Space Exploration mod, and it says a beacon overload layout. And so here now we've got a single beacon and lots of machines being affected by the single beacon. In the SpaceX mod, you do get the ability to add in lots more modules to a single beacon. I believe they stack up, and there's like a wide area effect beacon as well. So basically the idea of the mod is that if a single machine has more than one beacon affecting it, then it will basically just turn off. That feels, if I'm honest, a lot more realistic. The point that's being made in the blog is that effectively there is an optimal solution, which is to only put one beacon for every so many machines. So if you think about this, it's almost like a flipped on its head 8 beacon build, because where you would normally have a load of beacons down the middle and outside, instead there's just a central row of them, and you've got to be careful with the spacing. But that's all you're doing, really. The compensation Erendor has given for only allowing one beacon is the lots and lots of modules in a single beacon. And so effectively that single beacon is just replacing a line of 8 beacons. Where things get more varied is with the wide area beacon from Space Exploration, as you end up designing entire builds around a single structure. However, this gets rather inconvenient to tile, as you need to avoid overlapping machines with multiple beacons. The size of the entire build is dictated by the range of the beacon, so it is almost always clustered around one beacon, or a short line of beacons in a modular fashion. So I'll zoom in on these in a second. I'll just read the caption. Examples of wide area beacon layouts by Sticklord and Oblivion. 2 Space Exploration speedrunners. These focus on direct insertion to make a key product within the range of a single wide area beacon. I say we'll just zoom in. There is actually there's like a black line separating these, so it's actually 4 builds. There's not much point kind of trying to explain what's going on here, not least of all because I've not got this far in Space Exploration myself. But as you can clearly see here, this is the wide area beacon in the middle, and as you can see it's got 2, 4, 5, it's got 15 modules in a single machine, and clearly its area of effect is something along those lines. So every single machine here is getting a huge speed boost from just a single beacon. So from a power and resource efficiency point of view, it's way, way, way better. But the point is, if you look at these builds, they are all quite repetitive. You've got some variation because you need to put different things in different machines. But essentially, you're looking at using a rate calculator of some description to work out the ratios of these and then building them into a certain space. And I say they do look good. One of the things I would say about them is they do look a lot like the city block style of building. These are contained blocks, so it sort of makes a sense from that point of view. And you can imagine a base like this where you've got this single beacon in the middle of your city block, and that's defining the size of the block, and then you're squishing the machines in as you need them. Although they're repetitive in a sense, and they are kind of restricted by what they can do, all of these builds are quite different. You've got different layouts of different things going on. It's not just a grid of squares, basically. I mean, it is, but on a different scale. But, it's not just that 12 beacon or the lines and lines and lines of 8 beacon. We've got lines, but they're lines of different machines, and I guess the advantage space exploration has there is that it has a lot of different machines of different sizes, I can't remember what it's called, that super furnace and the recyclers, the crushers and all this sort of stuff are differently sized machines. So that forces a sort of a new design dynamic on it. You have a lot of flexibility in how you build within the beaconed area, so it can be nice for direct insertion builds. In the big picture, it puts all of the design freedom on building within the beacon space, but the placement options of the beacons themselves gets pretty boring. It's just another grid. So again, we'll have a sort of a zoomed in look on this one. The caption just says, a fairly typical wide area beacon setup in space exploration. This build by Xylokite has 3 wide area beacons in a line and is designed to stack vertically so that the beacons form a grid. And here we go. So again, it is a very rigid kind of grid structure because you can't have these overlapped, otherwise your machines will stop functioning, so you have to have them a certain distance apart. Obviously it's a multi-step process, so you have to step through that process as you go, and what this person is clearly focusing on, as it says in the caption, is a tileable build. But of course it can't really overlap. I guess belts could probably overlap, but it can't really overlap because if it does, your machines turn off. So basically this design can be stamped down vertically in order to, increase the production. I guess my sort of potential counter to this, and I've not seen a lot of space exploration bases, so maybe not, but my sort of counter to this would be that, sure, you get repetition of it, but I'm guessing each of these designs ends up looking different because of how Arundel has designed the actual production chain. So whether it gets crushed or put into a chemical plant or into a furnace or into a centrifuge, or by having different steps in the process, that's how you end up with different designs for each different type of material. To what extent, as I say, Arundel has actually done that, I don't know, because I've not got there. But you have the flip side of that way of doing things, that you've got loads and loads and loads of recipes in space exploration, and also, alternate recipes. So, you're going to overwhelm the player with the complexity of, especially new players, overwhelm them with the complexity of what they've got to build. So yeah, it does sort of feel like maybe the real solution that Arundel has kind of generated to the beacon problem is actually in the complexity of all the recipes and everything you've got to build and the logistics, rather than actually necessarily solving the beacon problem itself, because they are just a grid again. Hidden beacons from the built-in beacons mod. This mod is an experiment which tries to simulate what if beacons did not exist in the game and increase the crafting speed of the machines instead. It's ever so slightly too big for how it's zoomed in, but you're not really missing anything. It's just like some circuits at the top there. But this is the sort of an array of machines with this mod enabled, and the caption just says a standard but just faster layout with built-in beacons. So effectively what this mod does is it incorporates the module effects and beacon effects into the machine itself. So you don't need to put down separate beacons, you just get that effect tied into the modules. The result of this is that factories never need to transition into improving production rates by layout changes, other than routing in more belts, which can be seen both as a negative and a positive. On one hand, you still have all the possibilities as in the early stages, and snaking more belts through is great fun, but at the same time it doesn't introduce anything new. I mean, it's interesting, I guess. It's difficult to know quite what the difference this would be. So if you're not familiar with mods like Bobs and Angels and those sorts of things, a lot of them introduce alternate recipes, which is another way of giving a similar sort of effect where, you provide a different recipe that is more productive, basically. So effectively, it's giving you what a speed/productivity boost would do, but, through a different route. So that's another option. But what those mods also usually do is they give you higher and higher tiers of machines. And this is effectively the same thing. Instead of adding in beacons or fiddling about with that side of the mechanics, you can instead create, a level 4 assembler, a level 5 assembler, a level 6 assembler, which is more and more powerful in some way. Maybe it's got more module slots, maybe it's got a faster crafting speed or what have you. And that's effectively doing what more beacons does. And the point really is it kind of doesn't really change anything. Effectively what you do when you're using those is you just upgrade all your machines all the time. You come up with a layout and then you just upgrade the machines and your belts. And what they also do, Bob's in particular, just gives you loads and loads of extra belt levels. So you can just feed in more and more and more material for machines that consume more and more and more material. So yeah, it's kind of another way of doing exactly the same thing, really. So this next screen capture just says a direct insertion layout with built-in beacons. What's actually going on here is it's taking raw materials in. So we've got iron ore and copper ore coming in, and it's producing yellow science packs, so gold science packs. You can actually see lube coming in as well. So it's basically like a sort of a single factory producing from raw materials one of the high-level science packs. And it's a very compact build, and I'm sure with all the modules that are in there and what have you, it's probably really quite productive. And I would say it's the same with a lot of these mods that introduce all these extra machines. You need to give a reason to upgrade them, in the sense of you need a material or a thing that you're adding into the machine, and it gets very repetitive. This is what I always found about the mods that as I've been playing them through. It's just the same thing over and over again. It's just now you're adding in a titanium plate, now you're adding in an aluminium plate, now you're adding in an aluminium gear wheel, and so it's just more and more of the same. And to have that in the actual base game, and so that's fine for mod. That's not a problem at all. It can be whatever it wants to be. But for the base game, I don't think that's a viable solution. The one new thing it does introduce is that it becomes viable to directly insert items between machines without losing out on crafting speed. You can create builds that, for example, craft utility science packs from mostly raw materials, which can obviously be done in a wide variety of ways. Although this gets quite crazy to design, often with excessive use of rate calculators, it's something that I found cool, but I wouldn't expect many others to enjoy. And the basic point there is that things get so mathematically complicated that you can't really do it yourself. You could with a spreadsheet, and if you knew what you were doing, you could probably basically work it through. This is, as I say, literally taking in iron ore and copper ore and spitting out yellow science packs. So it's going through all of these steps using as much direct insertion as it possibly can in order to make that happen. And when you get to that sort of stage, I say your options are like a massive spreadsheet that you've worked out, or using something like a rate calculator. And I don't think they want to put something like a rate calculator into the game because it's a bit cheaty, if I'm honest. So yeah, this is another option, but not really one that's viable for the base game. Mod limitations by Arundel. Neither of us imagined that our mods would be the right solution for the base game. We were aware of the shortcomings, but mods are very limited in what they can do with beacons in 1.1. Other mods have experimented with different beacon mechanics too, but anything more interesting than some basic value changes requires a lot of unpleasant workarounds and runtime scripting. There are some creative approaches out there, but none of those mechanics are right for the base game either. Even within the context of space exploration, beacon overload wasn't the solution that I wanted. It was the best solution I could find with the options I had and some light scripting. I looked at a lot of options, but gradually ruled most of them out as impossible or impractical with the engine limitations and ended up with beacon overload. Obviously, these limitations aren't a problem if we can just change the game engine, but we can't change the game engine for every idea we have, or everything would get slowed down. Ideally, if we have a good idea, we rapidly prototype it as a mod to test it. An interactable demo makes it easier for other people to evaluate the idea too. The problem in this case is that we knew that the solution will be so far outside of what the game engine can do that whipping up a mod for it wouldn't be practical. Instead, we'd need to go through all our ideas in detail, find the best one, and be pretty sure it's the right one before we make a prototype version. So I'm not really going to comment on that. It's kind of really an explanation of how they arrived at this. The basic point is that types of things they wanted to do were sufficiently complicated that they were big engine changes. And of course you can't just turn around, especially with a game that's already launched and has loads and loads of features in it, that you're not really completely rebuilding the entire game as such. You can't really go testing out certain ideas because it would require a massive game rewrite. And so you have to be fairly sure that what you're going to do is going to be better, or before you can sort of justify trying them out. It does touch on a couple of interesting other points though. The first is it's interesting to see that that's how they do a lot of their feature additions. So the person with the idea, I don't know if maybe they do it directly, maybe they're not one of the devs with a lot of coding experience, maybe they work with someone who has, type of thing. But it sounds like they've got a concept and they do it as a mod before looking at it for inclusion in the base game, which is a really sort of clever idea. And it's sort of a really interesting side benefit of making a game that is so moddable. A lot of development studios, they add modding support as a secondary afterthought, but clearly it's so sort of baked into how they do things in Woobi. It's a bit like when you get these games where they give you a modding tool and it basically you find out later that's what they gave to their gameplay scripters, their gameplay designers, their quest designers, those sorts of things. They're just giving you access to the tool that the people use to build the game. A great example of that is actually Bethesda games, where they give you access to that creator engine. And you can basically write entire missions and scenarios and all this sort of stuff, create NPCs and all that. And what you're using to do that, obviously you can do it in different ways, but the creator tool that they give you is actually how the devs in the actual studio build the game. So yeah, this is obviously a kind of a version of that, how they prototype things as well. I'm guessing it's not the only way they do things, but that's interesting that that's fundamental of how they do it. The other thing this touches on is, I've kind of touched on this a couple of times before, but one of the key things that a game requires that kind of a lot of other entertainment media don't, is that a game needs to be fun. And you can only often find out that a game is fun once you can play it. And getting to the stage where it's playable takes a heck of a lot of effort. And it's one of the reasons why you get scope change and complete design overhauls late on. Now, I'm not saying that that isn't problematic for other reasons and may be happening for other reasons, but if you design a game and build a game and you get to a point where it's sufficiently together that you can test it, and you test it and it's not fun, then you have to go back to the drawing board sometimes. You have to just change your ideas and see if they work better. And that may require a lot of effort, and you may have told your publisher that you're going to publish the game in 6 months or what have you. So it is one of the fundamental difficulties of making a game rather than any other type of entertainment. So I think that gets a little bit lost sometimes in some of the simple arguments people make. But it's the flip side to that they're really talking about, is that if you are saying, right, well, there's a problem with beacons, you've got to have a pretty good idea of what solution you're going for, because beacons are so fundamentally baked into the game that if you're changing things with them, you need to properly change the game. And doing that is not a simple change. So say, if you're in a stage where you're saying it's not fun, well, is it really not fun? Is that just your opinion, or what's that backed up by? And if everyone agrees it isn't fun, well, what are you proposing as a change? What are you going to do that's different that makes it more fun? And once you've got that idea, how are you going to test it without it taking months and months and months of effort, only for you to, at the end of it, discover it's not any more fun than what you had before? The solution. By V. Our dreams were always in the idea of diminishing returns. The more beacons you would surround a machine with, the less effect each of them would have. If you were to ask me what this was going to be about, obviously the title kind of gives it away, but the obvious solution, or the one that seems to make the most sense, is some kind of diminishing returns mechanic, where if you really want, you can still cram on 12 beacons, but the benefit you're getting from that, for most players, is basically making that pointless. And by forcing people out of that 8 or 12 beacon idea, opening up other possibilities, you kind of make it so that design becomes a part of it. But as I say, implementing that sort of thing could be quite tricky. However, counter questions and doubts were in place. Firstly, are we sure this is really strictly better, or are we just trading one flawed system for another? Secondly, at least we know the flaws of the current system, and it is not that bad. Thirdly, wouldn't it be worse that it's more difficult to calculate the result effect in your head if it's not linear? And lastly, we don't have time to implement something we're unsure about. And until 1.0, the negatives seem to outweigh the potential positives. But the dream was always in the back of our minds, primarily via Erendel. In fact, we were so notorious with it that when Boss Kid was refactoring some parts of the beacon effect code, he did it in a way which would allow something like this, just in case it was desired eventually. And desired it was. Erendel whipped out his proposal. The effect transmission being the square root of the beacon count, buffing the base transmission effect from 50%, it's 0.5, adding in quality scaling for effect transmission. I've tested it and finalised the values. So I guess just to run through those three, the effect transmission being the square root, basically that's like an inverse square thing. If you've got a straight line at the moment, it's a linear effect. If it was an exponential increase, which exponential means literally the square, like the exponent basically is what you call that 2 or 3, that is the number of times you multiply it. But if you had an exponential increase, then it would do that curve that you've probably seen before. Whereas if it's effectively the inverse of that, which is the square root, then you get an effect like that, basically, where it goes up fairly rapidly and then it tails off. And that's it, because if you think about it, as you go up by squaring numbers, so if you square 1, you get 1, you square 2, you get 4, you square 3, you get 9, you get 16, 25, it increases very rapidly. And of course you get the reverse effect of that. So if you square root 25 and it drops down to 5, numbers below that are going to be very similar, if you see what I mean. So the square root of 24 is not going to be that much different, and the square root of 26 is not going to be that much different to the square root of 25, because I say you're getting that type of curve going on. So in the base game, the transmission effect for beacons is 50%. What that means is, and it's why you need so many modules when you're building your big mega base, is that although a beacon holds 2 modules, really it's only transmitting half the effect of each of them. You can, of course, mix things. There's very little done with efficiency modules in beacons. Typically, it's generally just speed in them. But if you put in 2 speed modules, effectively, that's like putting 1 speed module in the machine. So when you surround it with 12 beacons, you need 24 modules, but you're only getting an effect equivalent to putting 12 in the machine. And that's one of the things that they've changed quite significantly, because now it's going to be higher than that. They're going to buff it, so it's going to make it higher than 50%, which will make every module that you build count more, basically. Adding in quality scaling for effect transmission. This is a bit of a big change, because what they're basically saying is that, well, just to explain, when they introduced quality, they basically just said that beacons would be less power hungry to run, which was great. That was a good improvement. They're now saying that there's a quality effect for effect transmission. So in other words, the amount of the percentage of the beacon it transfers, I should say module. So the amount of the module it transfers now improves as you get better quality beacons and modules, I think. So in other words, a level 5 quality beacon with level 5 quality modules will transfer more of its effect, making that a much more useful thing to have. Not that the power improvement wasn't useful in and of itself, but that's basically saying, right, well, here you go, here's a great big improvement out of getting a quality beacon. Now, given quality items are difficult to produce, you might say, well, is it really that beneficial? But if you imagine you put in one level 5 quality beacon with level 5 quality modules, so that's just 2 modules that you need, it's going to have a massive boost on all the machines that it hits. So you could take an approach of saying, right, well, I don't really care about doing a 20,000 a minute mega base or what have you, and I've only got limited space because I'm still working on Vogor and all that sort of stuff. But if I stick in one super beacon and a bunch of super modules, that's a massive boost that it's giving me, and I'm just having to produce 1 beacon. So that is a huge improvement, I think. The story behind the numbers. Arundel's original idea included the square root calculation, but we imagined buffing beacons from 0.5 transmission to 1.0, in particular because it's a nice number. On top of that, by making beacons get less crazy in high counts, we could allow them to scale with increasing quality as well. In other words, it's like a self-compensation thing. So basically they're saying that adding on 12 beacons rather than 8 beacons isn't giving you that much of a big improvement, but switching them from level 1 quality to level 3 quality, that gives you a huge boost. So instead of slapping down repeating 12 beacon builds, how about making a 4 beacon build, but all of those beacons are quality? And therefore you've got more of an incentive to use quality items. In an earlier Friday Facts, we stated that beacons only decrease their energy consumption with higher quality because we thought quality makes things crazy enough already, and we don't want to push it any further. But since then, we have buffed belts 4 times with the item stacking, so it sounds a lot more appealing now. That's the new stack inserter, basically, the new white one, where it puts actual stacks on belts. And of course, they've also got the level 4 belt. So there is now an insane amount of material that you can send at any one machine. Playing with it, I quickly came to the conclusion that a 2 times buff is insufficient and low beacon amounts still feel weak, while high numbers are also nerfed. I figured I'd try to double it again and went with a 4 times buff. When I spoke to Arundel about this later, he noted that that's also the value he picked for the beacon overload. And I was happy to get the reinforcement that if we independently arrived at the same value, it probably confirms it is good. So you have to just slightly remember that this is the buff. So it's not that he moved it from 1 to 2 and then to 4. He moved it from 0.5 to 1 to 2 because it's 4 times buff on 0.5, not 4 times buff on 1, basically. So you have to slightly bear that in mind. When I was wrapping up the changes and preparing to present it to the final boss, Covarex, I made sheets and a graph. Ah, dear. The way that's written. Dear. I felt silly that I hadn't realised that square root of 16 beacons is 4. So if we buff beacons 4 times, it means all builds with less than 16 beacons get buffed. This felt like it's obviously too much, so I settled on 3 times, which results in transmission power of 1.5. I'll try and explain that one. It makes sense when you really think about it. You have to slightly remember that we're now getting several big machines in the base game that are going to be able to get a 16 beacon effect. So essentially what it meant, if you take it up to 4, and I say because of this square root thing of the relationship that, Arundel's proposed, effectively everything below 16 beacons, because 4 times 4 is 16, means that everything with a 16, less than 16 beacons was getting improved, which is kind of defeating the point of what they were going for. They're trying to go for this thing where a 12 beacon is less beneficial than it currently is. So if they put it as a 4 times buff, then a 12 beacon would actually get improved, and that's not what they want. What they want is you can already see it in the graph already, they want a crossover point for beacons, comparing the original with the new version, where essentially they're debuffing, they're nerfing a large number of beacons in order to kind of discourage people from doing it, or from making quality versions, which of course is adding in an extra mechanic and a whole way of processing and a whole new thing someone has to do before that bigger number of beacons becomes worth doing. No, that's not quite right. It's not that it's not worth doing, it's that the cost benefit of it is significantly different. So the amount of effort that you need to put in is not reflected in the gain that you get for the machine, unless you make legendary. And of course, if you're going to make legendaries, then you've got a huge investment and production challenge anyway. So they are kind of nerfing it, but giving you an option of working around the nerf if you use quality. And of course, quality is difficult to do. Hopefully that explained that. It does. The charts really just kind of show it, really. With either 4 or 3 times buff, the quality scaling needed to be brought back down a bit. So instead of 1 to 2.5, like on most other things, the transmission strength scales from 1.5 to 2.5 for beacons, which is still great. They still do reduce their power draw too, after all. I was almost in tears to see how beautiful the values turn out. So yeah, the charts I think really show it. You don't kind of have to really look at the numbers as such, but you can get the feel for what's going on with the chart in particular. So this blue line here, this straight line, that's what happens with the current game. And what's being shown on the x-axis, or along the bottom here, is the number of beacons. I actually wish they'd extended this to 0. I mean, in theory, this chart in a sense is nonsense because it's lines and it would actually be discrete points. You know, you can't have half a beacon basically, but setting that aside, if you imagine every single of these one starts at 0 because 0 beacons have 0 effect. So if you add on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as you're adding more and more beacons, this is the effect you're getting. So in the base game at the moment, one beacon has a half transmission effect. So in order to have the effect transmitted of 2 modules, you have to have 2 beacons on, if that makes sense. So a single beacon only transfers the effect of one of its modules, even though it's got 2 in. So 2 machines, it's 4 modules, but the effect you get is 2. Yeah? So you've got to remember that this is, halved effectively from what almost intuitively you would expect. But basically it's linear. So the more that you put on, the more effect you get, and that in a sense was the problem they were trying to correct. The red line then is 2.0 with no quality applied. So that is what will happen in the base game when we go to 2.0. And as you can see, because it starts at, was it 1.5? I can't remember what the number was, but it starts at a much higher value and it rapidly increases because it's this inverse square. So initially you get a bigger effect per single beacon that you add on compared to the base game. So in other words, that curve is positive initially. It then reaches a point around 3 beacons where it's kind of having the same linear type effect. Yeah? And then the effect slowly declines as you increase the number of beacons. In other words, the more that you're applying, the less benefit you're getting out of each beacon. What they were trying to do, essentially, when you sort of read between the lines of what they're talking about, is they're kind of trying to achieve a crossover point, so that at some point, the new style of doing it is worse than the old style of doing it. But in order to encourage you to use beacons and that they are worthwhile having, they've started higher up. So for lower numbers of beacon builds, then you have a higher benefit compared to the base game at the moment. But these higher level beacons, these higher numbers of beacons are less effective. They're still more effective than having the previous number. 11 beacons is worse than 12 beacons. It's just that the gain you're getting, which is that increase there, is not as much as the gain you're getting down there. In other words, there isn't a massive impact from going to 12 beacons from 8 compared to what happens in the base game. What they've then done is they've made legendary, and this is legendary is the top tier of quality, so presumably there are curves that, or there'll be curves that fit in between here for level 1 quality, 2 quality, 3 quality, 4 quality, 5 quality. So there's actually a series of curves here. This is just the 2 extremes of no quality and legendary quality. But basically this is the benefit you get from going from a single normal quality beacon in 2.0 to a legendary quality beacon in 2.0. Now actually these curves diverge. So what's actually happening here is that you're getting more of an improvement from going up in legendary than you are from normal. So legendary is always better than the current base game. Okay, that's the first thing to note. The second thing to note is, if you say that these are actually steps, because you're adding on discrete beacons, it does have the diminishing return thing, yeah? It's not quite as extreme, and it only really kicks in there. But if you look at the gap between these two, this gap actually increases as you go up. So in other words, there's more of a benefit from coming along. If you've done a design, and it's, say, 3 beacons on it, There's more of a benefit from coming along and replacing those 3 with level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 quality beacons than there is from completely rebuilding and redesigning so that you get, more beacons on it. Of course, that's compensated for the fact that building those machines is quite expensive. That's quite an expensive improvement to do. But it makes it much more of a decision that you're making rather than just the default, right, well, the best thing to do is to whack 12 beacons on it. Because now that is beneficial, but only up to a certain point, and then it becomes more expensive every time you do it than the benefit you're getting. And instead, maybe you should focus on increasing the quality of the beacons. It kind of suggests a way of playing where you make builds that will allow you to put beacons in, but you get to a point where you've filled in those beacons, and actually it's probably better for you to have made a quality build and to look at making quality beacons and just replacing what you've got rather than completely rebuilding it to a 12 beacon design. And if you think about it from a practicality point of view, that's kind of the transition they're almost trying to stop from happening, where they want you to be thinking more in terms of, right, can I upgrade my beacons now, rather than, I need to rip up my factory and insert the exact same 12 beacon build as everyone else does. Yeah, so it's a bit of a sort of a mindset change they're kind of going for. So it says the change is surprisingly minor for existing factories. Machines affected by 8 beacons will in fact perform 6% faster, while machines with 12 beacons get 13% slower. That's amazing because it means base game remains almost the same. We get the buffs we have always wanted, and quality allows even more progression. The results. Using beacons feels actually impactful even if you place just a few of them. In Space Age, this is especially important as that's typically when you want to increase your production to launch a lot of rockets. As productivity modules decrease the machine speed, with the old system, the first 2 beacons only get the machine back up to 100% crafting speed. At that point, you consciously know that you made an upgrade thanks to the increased productivity, but it doesn't really feel as exciting when the perceived speed is roughly the same. Now, because a single beacon has 3 times the effect, that is more than enough to break through the negative effect of productivity, which feels much better. So caption just says, a basic electronic circuits build, now with plus 24% productivity and a plus 50% speed with just a few beacons. So as you can see, these single beacons that have been dropped in are really only going to be affecting a single machine, but that boost is taking it over 100%. This is one of the things I always felt with modules and the way they did beacons, was that it always felt weird to be putting just the one beacon on, because what you're effectively doing is just returning the machine to normal. It's like there's always a fairly strong argument very early on in the game that really you shouldn't just be putting all productivity in a machine. What you should do instead is maybe put, for a green machine, you put say 3 productivity and 1 speed in, and then kind of not worry about the beacon until later, because that effectively does the same thing or very similar. It takes it back up to Unity production basically. And so your beacon is just feels like this massive power draw for no real improvement. You're just cancelling out the effect of productivity modules, and so it always felt a bit weird, if I'm honest. In some situations, it's not just about being able to afford beacons, but the building space is limited. So high effect beacons are a natural fit for places like space platforms. So this is a space platform with a beacon. And as you can see in the middle here, it's actually an efficiency beacon. This is one of the things I've been wondering about with the Space Age expansion. We've not really got anything in relation to efficiency modules or anything like that. And as you saw in this case up here, these 12 beacon builds, these 8 beacon builds, they're all just speed and prod. There's no real use for efficiency modules. I think the only time I ever really build efficiency level 3 modules is for the power armor. They're just not really that beneficial. Now, as it turns out, they probably are. Probably whacking them in mining drills in particular is probably a really good idea for a big mega base, because it cuts the amount of power demand enormously. The sort of irony is it's really the beacons themselves that you want efficiency on, which is what quality's giving us, you see. As I say, when I did this 1,000,000 solar panel build, what I really would have wanted was to reduce the power demand from the actual beacons, not necessarily the effect they had on the machines, because the effect they had on the machines was kind of negligible in the grand scheme of things. So having a high quality beacon that has this hugely reduced power demand actually seems like a really beneficial thing. And so then being able to take, high quality modules, and as you can see here, they're actually putting them in machines so that they're in this assembler. This set of what we got, crushers and smelters and chemical labs, they're all affected by this one beacon, but it's got level 3, quality 3 modules in a quality 3 beacon. So it's having a really big effect. And this to me seems like the natural fit for efficiency now. If we're not going to get a machine that has super efficiency or what have you, using beacons and actual efficiency modules on platforms seems really useful, because we know that power is going to be a real issue. They're not doing it here, but we saw on a previous Friday Facts they were putting foundries on a space platform. So being able to stick, efficiency modules in it so that it reduces this enormous power demand that it has seems like a really sensible thing to be doing. And therefore you're actually going to want to build efficiency modules, because who builds efficiency modules? So it just says space platform with a beacon, and then it goes on to say, as a complete novelty, a single beacon with green modules can actually drop the energy of a machine significantly. This gets especially crazy with higher qualities as the beacon effect transmission increases. The efficiency module gets more powerful, and the beacon reduces its power draw with higher quality, so it's worth it even more. All of the machines in the above video have minus 80% energy consumption, which is huge. If you've only got a very small amount of power production, eking that out over more machines seems like a really good idea. Space platforms can then choose to balance between crafting speed, power efficiency, and productivity, all of which are actually significant in the limited space, so it's an interesting choice to make and think about. Larger structures like the foundry typically have a high crafting speed in order to feel more powerful and be reasonably space efficient compared to smaller entities. Due to the size, they can be reached by more beacons, 16 for the 5x5 foundry, which increases their already crazy crafting speed a bit too much. The diminishing returns make these differences more reasonable. Don't worry, the foundry still gets insane, especially with all the quality bonuses by the endgame. So 5x5 foundry clearly gets the full 16 effect going on. However, what they've done with this curve is that's now like a huge gap between what you would get from the current base game versus what it is in 2.0 for in the expansion. Trading a few beacons for the ability to put machines next to one another is probably going to result in some new possibilities for some UPS optimization builds. So what that's getting at, and it shows it here, you've got a lot of direct insertion going on. But if you look at these machines, in both the 8 and the 12 beacon build, you cannot put machines next to each other. What you can do is you can use chests in some cases to transfer things around almost directly, but you cannot do literal direct insertion between any of these machines, either in 8 beacon build or 12 beacon build. It's literally impossible because beacons are in the way or force you to put machines next to each other. And that's kind of one of the hidden little benefits to this, because by encouraging people not to do gigantic numbers of beacons on their machines, they can perhaps focus more on direct insertion. And direct insertion is always way better for UPS. So this build uses a lot of direct insertion. The caption just says, I don't dare to make any kind of claim that this is an UPS efficient build, but you get the idea, and I'm thrilled to see what kind of designs you come up with. With quality, you'll be able to make even better use of the few expensive modules you get by putting them in the best quality beacons you can get. Another thing that quality adds to consider is that maybe you don't quite have many legendary speed modules, but plentiful productivity modules or vice versa, which could majorly impact what kind of a build is more affordable for you at the time. It could even influence the long-term strategy of which planet you visit first. So I guess part of the point they're making there is around this RNG thing. If you've happened to roll, you've maybe got a very small little area that's dedicated to doing a bit of legendary, production. It's not massive scale. You're just hoping to get a couple out of it. And it's made, say, 5, legendary quality speed modules, but no legendary quality productivity modules. Then that impacts what sort of build you might make. If you've got that one level 5 speed module that you can spare to put into a machine, where's the best place to put it? should you build your factory around having a few speed modules, Because one of the things we have to remember is, these 12 beacon builds, 8 beacon builds, all these sorts of things, these are end game for people who want to build big. The average player is not necessarily going to be building at these sorts of scale. So if you've got some nutty design that you've put together based around the fact that you've got 3 legendary speed 3 modules, and that's it, then that's kind of facilitated a bit more by this whole approach to doing this. You don't have to be focusing on getting ridiculous numbers of legendary speed modules. You can just do a few, and then you can come up with a design that really helps take advantage of those. Conclusion. I've been annoying all in my surroundings, including Coverex, by constantly talking about the beacon mechanics on and off for about 7 years now. It's got to the point where if I brought it up, I'd get the reaction, "Oh, you with your beacons again." And frankly, I couldn't blame them. In the last few months, I had already abandoned hope that we would ever implement this, as the expansion seemed to be getting feature complete. But one day we were having a discussion with Arundel and asked him what would be the last feature he'd like to happen. Arundel replied with a single word, in a very excited and to me surprisingly very confident voice: "Beacons!" The information I was missing was that he already did some research with Boskid earlier and told me the code is basically ready for it. I was shocked in the most positive manner. It only took us a few days to have the working version, and finding the right values took only a few weeks, which is great considering the scope of the change. The resulting values were better than I ever imagined, making the change really appealing, so convincing Coverex about it wasn't difficult in the end either. I imagine he was glad he shut it up. In 2.0, maximising beacon count will still generally be a good practice to have things produced quickly and save on computer performance. However, there will now be a lot more room for creativity, and with quality, return on investment comes into question more. So that's the point I've been making throughout, basically, that is it better to spend your resources sticking on more basic level beacons and, requiring more power and requiring all that productivity to make those extra modules for that? Or do you build a couple of high quality beacons and modules and keep a small build with those in it instead? Especially since you will get power benefits. You'll put the beacon in and actually your power level will reduce. If you're replacing an existing beacon, you put the new one in and your power demand will go down, not up. So you could build another machine with that. So where is the cost benefit for you as you're doing your playthrough? In general, this can be regarded as a buff to beacons, which should help you progress quicker, especially in the early stages of the game, which again improves space age being less tedious and more interesting. A detail that makes Boskid's implementation unreasonably exciting is that this behaviour is defined by a very simple so-called profile table in Lua. I'm not going to read that out, but basically it's defining a whole set of values that define these curves. So these aren't like functions in the game as such. It's basically a set of discrete values, which makes sense. You've got a discrete beacon, you can't have half a beacon, so it's kind of why have a function for it, basically. But what it means is that if you're replacing them, and he's about to explain this, but I'll just say anyway, but if you're replacing them, the functions that they've used, and you're coming up with new values, then you just have to plug in a bunch of numbers. You can do whatever mad function you want, work that out in Excel, and you just have to stick in a few numbers and you've got a new function. This means mods can revert beacons to work like in 1.1, trivially implement beacon overload, make a beacon overload which allows overlapping, make beacon effect increases with beacon count, or just about anything else they can think of. I'm incredibly happy to have Arundel by my side. As you can probably tell by both of us writing this blog post too, together we're able to make so many dreams become reality. A huge thank you also goes to Boskid, who listened to us and took regard when cleaning up the code to be ready for what we wanted. We're all extremely proud to have finally found a way to make a change that many of you have called for over the years as well. We've heard you, all things just have their time and place. Let us know if you're as thrilled by the effect this change is about to transmit as we are. Speculation then, overall thoughts. I am happy that we are getting a change to the beacons. The linear, just add more beacons on, everyone ends up with the exact same design, blah 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 blah, I would 100% agree with. The only flag of caution I would have is that I don't think this crossover point is quite in the right place. I would actually probably have it, if I could, like slightly below 8 beacons, I think, because what this to me does is it kind of makes because it's actually 8 beacons is actually better than it currently is. So that pushes everyone, I would suggest, towards an 8 beacon design. Would be my concern, that actually 8 beacon is better than it currently is. So that's where everyone will end up. That just makes all of the existing designs for 8 beacons even better designs, if you see what I mean. An 8 beacon is actually the least flexible, in my opinion. I think I would have probably advocated, if I'm totally honest, for a level 2 beacon as well. An example of how that could be different would be it has a different effect radius and perhaps a larger number of modules or something like that. But that perhaps base beacons were actually, not that beneficial at these higher levels. So perhaps the curve would be even sharper. I think it should have been... I think it's good that it's beneficial at lower levels, because if you think about the normal playthrough for a new player or a relatively inexperienced player or person who's done a couple of playthroughs or what have you, saying to them, right, well, actually beacons are now just better. They're just awesome from the beginning. Get beacons onto your builds. I think that's great, because I don't know about anyone else. When I did my first 3 playthroughs, I didn't mess with beacons and modules at all. I just didn't use them because it seemed like something that was really difficult to produce, and I couldn't really see how it was helping me in a sense. I was having enough difficulty producing, what I needed to produce and getting it on belts and not dying from spaghetti overload. Sticking in a few or even making a few modules and beacons was just not on my radar. When I eventually, did look at them, I realised how powerful they were and started using them. I use them really early if I can, and particularly level 1 and 2. I get them in machines almost as soon as I can. So to have something that then says, right, well, actually beacons are really great to have. The power demand of them is really outweighed by the benefit you get. So get a few of those in. I also think having that buff for their use on space platforms is really huge, because as we saw in this type of design, this one beacon, it's obviously quality as well, so it's showing off 2 things. But if this was simply a normal quality beacon, the fact that it's now transmitting its full effect for efficiency means efficiency modules become suddenly worth having, basically, especially on a power limited thing here. And of course we've got a planet, 2 planets now, where space efficiency is actually quite useful as well. And of course space efficiency means power efficiency as well. If you've not got that much room to put solar panels on or what have you, then having something that reduces the power demand of all your buildings that you can just stick in, nice and early is actually going to be great. So I do think there's a lot of upsides to the tweak to the curve, and I would 100% agree with the general point of making it a diminishing return thing. I say my concern would be for normal beacon builds that I'm going to get having legendary above them. Okay, to me it looks like if it's, kind of in extrapolating and interpolating the curve, when you get above level 3 quality, it's only ever beneficial compared to current base game. That doesn't seem high enough to me. I think it should be 4. I think 3 should be skimming into the bottom here. It shouldn't be that good for sticking all these machines on. And it's only when we get into 4 and 5 that it's really beneficial. So in other words, I would probably want a tweak to the curves. I know they've tested it. I've not had any experience with it. I've not touched it. I'm sure it does actually work. It's just, for me, looking at these curves, I would probably want this skimming in under the level 8, so that you don't just push everyone to do a level 8 build and then just upgrade things. Do you know what I mean? It just feels like an 8 beacon build and then just upgrade all of your beacons as you go. It feels like maybe a bit more of an encouragement for getting below that and builds that make, better use of space and are more interesting and rely on these quality, that you can just stick one quality beacon in there and it's more effective. Where is that point actually? So if we say 8 beacon is where people sort of might end up, it looks like 4 certainly is above. Maybe 3 is about equivalent to it on parity. So in other words, 3 legendary beacons look like they're equivalent to about 8 normal quality beacons. Is that enough of a ratio? I don't know. I'm not sure it is. 4 beacons is quite a lot of beacons, legendary beacons to be putting on for it to be better than an 8 beacon build. It's also better than a 10 beacon build. So I suppose that's why I'm looking at it. But it's not better than a 12 beacon build. Do you see what I mean? It's just that it feels like the red curve just needs a little tweak downwards. Or maybe the old upwards, just to push it even further towards 8 beacon not actually being all that much better. I guess it could be parity, it could be exactly the same, but it just feels like, to me, there's a little bit of a risk that actually this isn't quite going to do what they want it to do. We'll have to see. Really, it really is dependent. One of the things that is interesting in this, and I don't know if we knew that or not, but the EMP is smaller than the EMP, meaning electromagnetic plant, is smaller than the foundry. So the EMP is 4x4. I'm not sure I knew that. I think it has been said somewhere, but I just didn't twig. But the EMP is a 4x4 machine and the foundry is a 5x5 machine, which is where you see, so you've got this direct insertion here. They've got a spare slot there, spare tile there, but basically the 3 there is inserting, so it's one bigger than that, and this is one bigger again on the other side. But that means they're differently sized. But also, and I guess maybe, again, I just hadn't really tweaked this, a foundry can only take 4 modules, but an EMP can take 5. So we're getting more variety, and obviously a regular assembly machine takes 4, a green one takes 4, a chemical lab takes 3. They all have different crafting base speeds, although these two are the same, I think. And then you've got the variable number of beacons that you could theoretically put on them. So we're getting a lot more sort of variety in machines and the amount of effects that they have from beacons and the amount of modules inbuilt to them that they can have. So it's making the maths a bit more complicated, but it's clearly limiting it to a degree that means it's still obviously fun and playable. You're not going to the extent of having level 20 assemblers and all these mad things that happen in mods. So, and of course they could still add those things, but yes, I hadn't appreciated that the EMP was a 4x4 machine, whereas the foundry is a 5x5. So we can get different sort of modules and stuff on them. I did notice on this, is this sped up, do you think? To me, it looks like it's running, as in the video is sped up. It looks like it's running faster. But it also doesn't, because the green belt looks like it's going as the speed I'd expect. I get that the animation's now been sped up, but these inserters look to be going too quickly. But I don't know if that's because actually the stack inserter has a faster swing speed. That would be quite interesting to see, actually, because that impacts the amount of stuff that you can put on a belt with a single inserter. I hope you enjoyed today's Friday Facts video and might consider coming back for another one. If you'd like to chat about the latest Factorio Friday Facts, you can find me live streaming Factorio every weekend over on my Twitch channel at Trismegistus. Thanks for watching. Cheers. Bacony, bacony, bacon.